Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can mouse over or tap on the video playback area of your screen, and then you'll see chapter titles with links to those sections of the video, or you can use the timestamped links down in the video description. In this last podcast of 2020, I have a number of tidbits to share with you, as well as a look back on the projects that I knit this year. So let's get started. So this first tidbit is a pair of stockings. Really, it's two pairs of stockings, but I saw the first pair, a red and green pair, came across my Twitter feed from an account called Fleece to Fashion. And they have a link to the museum that has these stockings in their collection, and you can really look at them up close. And what I was wondering about were the red insert part. It didn't look knitted, and yet the transition from the green part of the sole to the red part was very smooth and didn't look seamed. And I asked a question about it, and they sent me a link to another pair of stockings that was similar but different colors, and I was able to see on that one that yes, the insert did shift from one color to another, and it was knitted, but as those stitches kind of turned, you know, as the way that the light was reflecting off of them gave them that same appearance of looking woven in the photograph. So I thought that was interesting, but I'm going to leave links to the two pairs of photographs because they're really beautiful, and you can really zoom in closely and take a really close look at them. So this next tidbit came from the Twitter feed of the Van Gogh Museum in the Netherlands. And it was a photograph of this little red case that Van Gogh kept in his bedroom of little balls of wool yarn. And what he would do was he would use this wool yarn to learn more about color theory. So the balls of yarn that they have, there's one of them that has all these different colors of yellows in them that you would have seen in certain famous paintings of his, and other ones where he was using really bright colors together to see how those worked together. So it was fascinating, and it reminded me that when I first learned to knit and I was living in Ireland, I had taken a year off college. And when I returned to finish up my degree, I shared an apartment with 3 other young women, 2 of whom were finishing up art school, and the third one was a graduate student in architecture school. I had bought some books by Kaif Fassett, who was really huge in the mid-'80s. It was like he was just exploding. His use of color was amazing in knitting, and he had written these beautiful books that showed how color could be used, how yarn could be used in all different really interesting ways. He would instruct you, if you want to make some sweater like the one he showed in the picture, just take a range of yellows and a range of blues and then just start, you know, blending them together as you're knitting, dropping one and picking up another one. And I'm like, well, that's a nice idea. I'm a college student. I don't have a huge room full of yarn, and I'm getting ready to move overseas for another year. So I really loved the idea of it, but it was not something that I could really aspire to at that time. But one of my roommates went to the yarn store with me because I said, I just really would love to be able to knit something like that, even if it means I can't blend colors in quite the way that he does. I just don't understand how to choose different colors. And I've talked about this before. I'm slightly colorblind, and that's part of the intimidation factor for me. But my roommate picked up 2 balls of yarn, and she said, you see how these look? And even if you put them next to each other, they look a certain way. And then she pulled one of the strands out from one of the balls, and she laid it across the other ball. And she says, you see how they change? Like the colors just change when they actually are physically next to each other. So that was what Van Gogh was doing when he was using yarn, strands of yarn in this way to see how colors could blend together before he tried it out using his more expensive materials, which were the paint. So anyway, I'll leave the link down below so you can see the photograph of his little case of yarn. But I was Googling around a little bit to try to learn more about this, and there was an article that I found that is called Strands, Interlacing, Color Theory, Education, and Play in the Work of Vincent van Gogh by Laura Coyle. So there are photographs in that article that are black and white, but she explains like what his influences were and how he came to use wool as part of his study of color theory. So if you might find that interesting as well, and I'll leave a link down below for that too. So I often talk about my involvement in the Minnesota Knitters Guild. So I was on the retreat planning committee last year, and then for this year, which of course we couldn't have it this year, but I will be on the committee for it the next time we can have a retreat. I try to volunteer anytime the guild has a booth somewhere, like at the state fair or someplace else, Shepherd's Harvest, which is our wool festival, so that I can meet other people in the guild and get to know them, but also so that I can tell people in the public about the Knitters Guild. One of the things that people don't understand about Knitters Guilds is that their purpose is to educate knitters. Most guilds are going to have two sort of primary focuses. One is educating knitters and the other might be charity work. So most guilds will have some form of charity knitting that they do. Nobody's obligated to do it, but they always, like our guild comes up with 3 or 4 different charities that they're going to knit for and what kinds of items that charity needs in the coming year. And then you can knit for those organizations and drop off the items at monthly meetings during normal times. And then there's educating knitters. And in our guild, one way we do that is by having monthly programs. And the programs are really aimed at all levels of knitters. And then we also host educational events. Typically, once a year, we have this big event that our guild calls Yarn Over, and we invite 15 nationally known knitting teachers to come for this weekend. And there's a marketplace, and we move the guild meeting program to that Sunday of that weekend at the hotel where the event's going on, so that people from out of town who don't usually get to go to a monthly meeting can go to one. So the purpose is not to cater to really advanced knitters. It's to educate knitters regardless of what level of knitter you are. So if you are a beginning knitter and you love the idea of a knitters guild, but you think maybe you don't really have the right stuff for it yet, you absolutely do. So I would encourage you, if you have a local guild, to get involved with one. And what I have found when I have joined local groups that have some focus on an interest that I have, whether it was writing or whether it's knitting, is that it's not really enough to go to the monthly meetings if what you're trying to do is interact with other knitters, because usually the program is taking people's attention and you don't have time to make friends. But if you volunteer for committees, if you go to the social events that they host throughout the year, our guild certainly does that several times a year. And if you volunteer anytime the guild has a booth somewhere, that's how you get to know other people in your guild and get so that you recognize them and see them when you do take classes locally. You'll see somebody that you know from the guild, and that's really how you sort of get more involved in your knitting community, especially when it comes to guilds. There is a national guild called the Knitting Guild Association. Some of the local guilds are associated with TKGA, but many are not. Ours is not. So TKGA was, again, founded with the purpose of educating knitters. And the first educational program they set up was the Master Hand Knitting program. And that was the program that I went through a number of years ago. But they have all sorts of programs and courses that you do by correspondence through the Knitters Guild Association. So I just thought I would bring that up because that is something that a lot of knitters don't realize, particularly when they're new. I've seen new knitters showing up at our local guild and saying, well, I'm just a beginner. And it's like, there's no, I'm just a beginner. If you are, regardless of what stage you are in your knitting, if you want to learn and you want to be around other knitters and you're interested in learning more, a guild is a perfectly valid thing for you to get involved with. Last year, I started buying vintage knitting manuals from the 1940s, and I collected the entire 8-volume set. of books that were written by these two women who were sisters-in-law, Jane Coster and Margaret Murray or McMurray, one of the two. I'll put it down on the screen. So it was a whole series of books. The first one was published in 1940, the last one in 1949. And they were really interesting. And I did, every time I got a couple of those books in the mail, I was talking about them last year. So a few weeks ago, I saw on my Instagram feed, somebody posted a photo of this particular book, Modern Knitting Illustrated, as well as another book that was not written by these two women, but it was published by the same publisher. And it's called The Pictorial Guide to Modern Home Knitting. And she mentioned that it was a really thorough knitting manual. It had a lot of great how-to stuff. And I thought, ooh, that's one that I don't have. And so I looked it up to see if I could find it anywhere. And I found it listed on Abe Books. That's a used bookstore sort of clearinghouse. It's like all these different used booksellers all around the world can list their books on Abe Books. So I found a copy of the book, and the seller was in the UK. So I knew, you know, it's the holidays, and it can take a while for books to get here. And because it's from overseas and it's holidays and COVID and all that, I did not expect to see this book until after the new year. But it came yesterday, and I spent yesterday afternoon really looking through it. And I'm going to do some overhead of it so you can see the types of things that are in here. But what was so interesting to me was how thorough of a knitting manual this was. These books here, in any given book, they would have covered certain aspects of modifications or design, or because it was the 1940s in the UK, make, do, and mend mentality of combining fabric with knitting. If you didn't have enough wool to make yarn to make something and enough fabric to make something, how you could combine them, or how you could recycle yarn by ripping out an old sweater. So these have a lot of great information in it. But very few of these vintage or antique knitting manuals that I found have had as much information as this book has on how to do certain things. Now, the techniques, a lot of them are really interesting because they aren't sort of the best practices techniques that we would use today. But they're fascinating because they give me perspective on some other things that I read about in vintage knitting books. For example, in the 19th century and even into the early 20th century, the purl stitch was often called a seam stitch. So when you're reading stocking patterns from the 1880s, and they're telling you to knit on the round, and they're telling you to create a seam stitch down the back of the leg. Now that would have been where a seam was if the stocking had been sewn, but it's not being sewn. But there is this column of stitches. It's usually every other round is a purl bump. So it's essentially a garter bump. And it's a raised bump, and it goes down the back of the leg. And what that allows the knitter to do is to make sure that they're getting shaping. So if they are making a really long stocking, they have to do decreases as they're going down the calf. They can make sure to do it the same place with respect to that seam line. They can make sure that they're mirrored in the same place. And in addition, because it's every 2 rows, that bump really sticks out every 2 rows, it's very handy for counting rows to make sure that you have the number of rows that you need or rounds that you need. So I had always assumed that it was called a seam stitch because it was creating a line where the seam would have been. But one of the things I was reading in this book, I'm always interested in any information they have on seaming because often that gets left out of knitting manuals. And I think it's because there weren't different seaming techniques for knitting than there were for woven fabrics. You would learn whatever you needed in woven fabrics, and you would use those same techniques when you were putting together a knitted item. And that's not what we do today. We use mattress stitch and other sorts of ways of seaming things together that aren't things that they used before like the 1960s. So one of the things that they were talking about here is that when you were doing side seams, they said to use over sewing. And I had a feeling that was like an overcast stitch or a whip stitch, but I wasn't sure. It wasn't a term that I had heard. So I went and I was looking it up. And so there's a family of seaming stitches called overcast stitches. And one of them is what we would call whip stitch, where you're basically just, you know, going around, you know, the edge like this. But buttonhole stitch is another type of overcast stitch. So I knit up a couple of swatches and I followed the instructions for how they were saying to do the overcast stitch. And I looked at it from the right side of the work to see what that would look like. And what I saw was basically a column. It's a very visible seam. You can see where the seam is. But there are all these horizontal lines going across it where you've done the whip stitch. And I thought, oh, this resembles a column of garter stitches. So now I have a different understanding of why they might have called a purl stitch a seam stitch, because it really does look like a seam. It isn't just forming the line where a seam would have been if there were two edges that had to be joined. It actually does resemble the type of stitch that was used for seaming. So what I'm curious about is if that is something you guys would be interested in seeing. Like, would you like to see side by side the techniques that were used, say 100 years ago, in knitted items versus the techniques that we typically would use today, if that is something that is of interest to you? Because if it is, then I'll put together some swatches and side by side and show you guys that. I just never know if that is of interest to other people or if it's just like me going down this rabbit hole and thinking it's the coolest thing ever. So this is the book that came in the mail yesterday. It's called Pictorial Guide to Modern Home Knitting. It was originally published in 1939. I imagine it was reprinted several times. It was written or is edited by Catherine Franks. They've got all the standard information in here about like needles and gauges and different types of yarns. They have a couple of different ways of casting on. It's interesting to see how they're telling how to weave in ends. It's not how we would say to do it these days. But they have different types of fabrics or textures that you get from different types of yarns and different types of stitch patterns. So, which is pretty common in a lot of knitting manuals. They have some stitch patterns. But then they also have actual garment patterns. There's a lot of underwear and swimsuit type things in this book, like a lot of underwear for everybody, all sizes and different types for every person. But they also have, you know, like sweater patterns, and like all vintage patterns, they come in one size. So you would have to modify it if you needed to make it bigger. But these books are pretty good about explaining certain approaches for modifications. And this book even has, I don't know if I can be able to find it, but it has information in here about, here it is, about knitting from dressmakers patterns. So like if you have a shape that you want to knit and then how to go about doing that, which I thought was pretty interesting. This spread right here about the process for making up or sewing together knitted garments, I thought was really interesting. They have a lot of information in here about selvages that are quite a bit wider than we would have today. Like you could do a seam, like they'd want you to add extra stitches so that you could have this fold back, but they tell you how to use your sewing machine to then sew a seam, which I thought was really interesting. More stitch patterns, and they have like drafts and guides for socks, like all the different parts of them and how they're working. And they have a couple of different types of heels and a couple of different types of toes. They also have a guideline for a sock that has different components that you seam together so that if you need to repair one part or another, you can do that more easily. Here it is. So they're showing you like you could knit the leg and the instep as one piece, and then knit the heel and the sole as the second piece, and then you knit the toe in the round. And then they want you to seam them all together using that over sewing stitch, the whip stitch, so that if you needed to take apart any and re-knit any part of it, you could do that. So then they have information on designing garments. So I've seen this in a few books from the 30s and 40s where they show you how to design things using a grid like this, and how you can figure out what pattern, shape, piece you wanted, and then figure out using your gauge how often you need to do your increases or how to do your shaping and that sort of thing. So that must have been a very popular thing in the 30s and 40s. It really wasn't something I've seen in books from the 1920s, and certainly not once you get into the 50s and 60s, when things seem to really change quite a bit. So these books, I think, are absolute gold, these books from the 30s and 40s. This was a crazy year. It was a really hard year for most of us, and I'm no exception to that. I felt like I spent a lot of my time this year staring out my office window rather than knitting. So I really wanted to take a look back at what I did accomplish this year, to see what I did every single month this year. And I'm really glad I did that. Before I start any project, I start a project page for that project in my Ravelry notebook, where I keep track of the yarn that I'm using, the needles that I'm using, who I'm knitting it for, and I might keep track of notes about how I'm doing something in particular, so that if there is another part to that project, like a sock where there are two socks, if I've knit one sock and put it to the side, I can look back at my project notebook and say, what needle was I using when I was knitting the first sock? Or what gauge was I knitting at? And so I have that information, and it saves me a lot of time getting myself back into those projects. Another benefit of looking back on this year's projects is realizing that there were several projects I hadn't posted any photos of at all, or if I'd posted a photo, it was at the early stages of the project and never took a completed photo. So that was a really good exercise for me. But most of all, it just made me feel like I did accomplish more than I thought I had in this year. So what I'm going to do is just show you what it was that was on my needles throughout the year. And on the screen, you'll see a picture of the project, and in most cases, who I knit it for. If there was a pattern, I will include the pattern name on there. But for any of those projects, if there's something you're interested in seeing more about it, learning what the yarn was or what the pattern was, and reading my notes in my Ravelry notebook, I will be leaving a link down in the video description to my Ravelry notebook, specifically to my projects for 2020. So all of the projects that you will see in the next few minutes are in that particular section of my Ravelry notebook. So it'll be easier for you to find in that huge, huge notebook of hundreds of projects. You'll see the ones that are just from 2020. As I was getting ready to record this episode of Casual Friday, I realized that it was season 3, episode 50, and that meant this is the 150th episode of Casual Friday. I started Casual Fridays in January of 2018, knowing that I had more to say about knitting than what I could say in my Technique Tuesday videos, but not really sure of what it was that I had to say. And I didn't really know how long I'd be able to sustain the second video every week. It turns out I have a lot to say about knitting, and I never stop learning about knitting and wanting to share what I've learned with you. I'd like to thank you all for showing up every week to watch my podcasts and for asking questions and suggesting topics for new videos that you would like to see me do. I truly appreciate the ways that all of you support my channel, whether it's by just sitting through the ads before the video starts, buying a pattern from my Ravelry pattern store, but I especially want to thank those of you who have supported me on Ko-fi by buying me a coffee when one of my technique videos has been very helpful to you, but especially want to thank those of you who subscribe for monthly support. I really, truly appreciate it. Without all of these ways that you support my channel, I really wouldn't be able to sustain doing it the way that I do. So thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful new year, and let's hope that 2021 is better than 2020. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next year.